we're honored to have Dr. Jill Shook, who will share some of the history of racism in housing, some of the national racialized housing policies, and how they played out in Pasadena with the long shadow of this still seen today. Dr. Shook holds a Doctor of Ministry from Bakke Graduate University and is the Executive Director of Making Housing and Community Happen. In 1991, she moved to Pasadena to study under Dr. John Perkins, African-American leader and founder of the Harambee Center and the Christian Community Development Association. After co-founding the Students and Tutors Achieving Real Success, or STARS, which was an after-school program at Lake Avenue Church, she helped house STARS families at Agape Court, an affordable housing complex in Pasadena. She was led to author and edit the book, Making Housing Happen, Faith-Based Affordable Housing Models, featuring what churches across the US are doing to address the housing crisis and break the cycle of poverty. In her doctoral work, she completed coursework on institutional racism in Chicago. She continues to conduct Housing Justice Institute and workshops all around the United States. Please welcome Dr. Jill Shook.
Thanks, everybody. What a nice introduction. I was truly amazed at when we saw the kids got moved into Agape Court, and to see how every one of those kids ended up graduating from college. The parents had time for their kids, and it truly changed my life to see the power of a sense of community in a place where kids felt safe and they felt and parents could afford. So that was so much of my beginnings, but the beginnings of housing injustice go way back. So it's going to be a little bit like a fire hose, but I want you to hold onto your seats and pay close attention. And so bear with me as I do the share. And if any of you are not muted, make sure you are. Thank you so much. Okay, can you all see this? I'm going to move that up a little. Just kind of raise your hand or something if you can see it. I'm going to make sure you all see it. Okay, great. So I can't. I need to be able to see it. All right. So if you look at some of the very early beginnings of California, the California Gold Rush, it was pretty amazing. So we had a soil constitution, had a free soil provision, allowing whites to claim land up to 160 acres per person. And if they would ban slaves, and yet no slaves were allowed to claim any land. So that was the start of California. And of course, you know, we took so much of the Mexican land. And then if you go to, I'm having trouble with seeing this. All right, let's see if I can do that and still look. The Homestead Act, again, that granted free land. And, but the problem was it was only for citizens, and there was no citizenship that was granted to either Mexicans or Blacks. So we have a couple of Frank Lloyd Wright's homes in Pasadena. They're gorgeous, and one here in Northwest. And it was interesting that he got on the bandwagon for this whole movement to help philanthropists clear back in the 1870s, kind of a movement for people to provide housing that's high quality. And these are still standing. This was affordable housing. And so it was really well built, way ahead of its time. And yet, if you think about the cost, when you have such high quality, it became unattainable. It was just too expensive. And then the very first building codes were in Chicago with Jane Addams. As many of you know, if you've taken any classes on social work, she was the original social worker. And they started looking at counting like how many deaths, what kinds of diseases. And in the process, they realized that ventilation and things like this were super important. So when you keep adding zoning codes, these were the first zoning codes in the country. And as you add those, it's going to add cost. In 1913 was when we started the mortgage interest deduction, which is kind of a sacred cow in our country. But if you look at that deduction for first and second homes, it ends up really helping wealthy homeowners. And it really doesn't trickle down. The US spends over 10 times more on housing subsidies to the wealthy than they do on affordable housing. And we've seen that's really the case also when it comes to racialized housing. When zoning came in, it really changed everything. There's some really good things about zoning. You don't want a factory right next to your house necessarily with a lot of fumes, but it started to be used in around 1910, 1920 in a negative way. So you can see that in Pasadena. We had actually a very racially mixed and economically mixed community before the 1920s. You had the big wide streets, the narrow streets, the larger kind of mansion type homes on the wider streets. The more narrow streets had servants' quarters. You had, I'm clicking and I didn't mean to. And so you had a racially mixed community. A lot of back houses were built then. And so then what started happening, they were looking at taking zoning and using that so that there was one whole community, part of the city that was all single family, another part all multifamily. And they started separating and making race a big deal in all of this. They started making what's called racial covenants so that in certain parts of the city, we'll talk of those in just a minute, but you couldn't buy a home if you were a person of color. It was illegal. What was also interesting, I think, is what we see here in Pasadena, they'd have a black part of the city, and then they would have industry around it, and that acted kind of like a barrier, or they'd have a freeway, and that was a buffer to keep the blacks away from the whites. And you can see some of that in Pasadena on Orange Grove, and kind of the separation in the 210, separating Northwest from the rest of the city. Especially, they would put almost all of the liquor stores in the black area. And so you can see an inordinate amount of liquor stores that were put into Northwest. And if you keep going here and you look at the different kind of restrictive covenants, there was one that I thought was, it's pretty crazy to think that in a neighborhood association that you signed that if you allowed anyone in your community to purchase that was a person of color, that that essentially you'd be reported, and this racial covenant would no longer be enforced. So there was a lot of pressure by neighborhood associations to make sure they all signed covenants. In Pasadena, there was about 65% of the homes that all had racial covenants, except in Northwest. There was actually real estate codes of ethics that if you were a realtor, you had to make sure that you held to these, or your license would be taken away. The presence of, it could be detrimental to your property values if you have someone of color that purchased in your neighborhood. What's interesting here, I want to tell you a little story about Bob Lavelle. In the first version of my book, an African-American who had a license to be a realtor, but he didn't have access to the MLS listing. And so he was really frustrated. He had hardly any homes to sell. And so he applied, but every year they turned down his $500 membership fee. They said, you can't join. And they said there weren't enough votes. So finally, somebody was defaming his character. He brought it to the courts. He actually brought it to the courts that that all the way up to the federal, and that ended up making it possible for any person of color to have a license and sell anywhere in the nation. So it's interesting in Pasadena, I meant to put this later in the presentation, but Blacks were not able to purchase homes any place other than Northwest for so long. And they couldn't get mortgages. And so in order for them to obtain mortgages, there was a man who had a hog farm in El Monte, and he wanted to help his people. And so he started a bank with all the money. He was also a trash collector, and so the edible trash he gave to his hogs, and his farm did incredibly well. And so it was called Family Thrift initially, and then later became One United. It was on the corner of Lake and Washington. I had an account there for a number of years, but it's sad that they had to leave the town. But I'm just really impressed that they figured out how to still get mortgages, even though they were barred in most banks. If segregation was enforced, and you could see signs like this isn't in Pasadena, but other parts of the country, where essentially, like scare tactics, entire blocks ruined by Negro invasion, and trying to scare people and to prevent people from being able to buy into this community. Let's see, I click that. So there was this home loan in 1933, home loan corporation, and one of the practices was redlining, and that's essentially where banks were not did not even provide loans to people in those areas that were red, and there were parts of Pasadena, especially Northwest, that were redlined. There's whole tons of research now on this. You can see in these maps, the redlining maps, all parts of LA County that were redlined that would intentionally force property values to go down. So they couldn't get loans to improve property on existing homes. They couldn't get loans to buy new homes. So you see places like La Cañada, where adjacent to Pasadena, it's pretty much all white, because they had, when they could finally get a loan, you had to have 10% down. And so people that had 10% down and they could move to the suburbs, when especially we started having the freeway, they could easily move if you had a car. And so, so you saw whole white suburbs all across the country starting to appear. And then if you go to looking at the GI Bill, so my dad was able to get a GI Bill. He was in the service, and we were able to buy our property because of that. And little did I know until later that most Blacks that got the GI Bill, they barred them from being able to use that for home purchases. So there's a book that I read in my doctoral work. I highly recommend it, The Promised Land, that talks all about the Great Migration. And so many of folks came to Pasadena after the mechanical cotton picker kind of ended sharecropping. And my mentor, Dr. John Perkins, he was one of those sharecropping families that actually moved to Pasadena after he got out of the Deep South. But there was riots in Chicago and around the country because of the lack of housing as people were moving to other parts of the country. Then it's interesting with public housing, because this was a way to try to supply sufficient housing, but there's a lot of flaws through public housing. There's still some really good public housing around the country that still stands. I think it's something we need to revisit now that we've learned so many lessons. But the poster child was Pruitt Ego. Pruitt was supposed to be, it was supposed to be integrated, but it ended up all one section white, all one section black. And it wasn't close to amenities, and it wasn't close to jobs. And so it really failed in how it was structured. So then in 1934, they created the Federal Housing Administration, and finally racial restrictive covenants were they started looking at stopping those. I'm going to go to the next slide, and it said basically that institutions seeking the tax exempt status must receive a public purpose, not contrary to established public policy. So they eliminated prejudice and discrimination and supposedly racial covenants, but it still appeared that you could not get a mortgage unless it had a covenant on it. And that was actually part of our federal housing policy. And so to try to undo a lot of this, there was the 1949 Housing Act. It's a beautiful, title for the act, a decent home and suitable living environment for every American. But up until then, all the national housing acts, they required one-for-one replacement. And now you didn't have to do that anymore. And so that cut down even more homes that would be built. And they called perfectly good Black areas slums, and so they could clear them. That happened in Pasadena, in the Parsons area, and it also in a part of North Fair Oaks. So it's just interesting as I look at scripture. It says here from Ezekiel, "For this is what the sovereign Lord says, enough, you princes of Israel, stop your violence and oppression and do what is just and right. Quit robbing and cheating my people out of their land. Stop expelling them from their homes, says the sovereign Lord. Use only just weights and scales." So as we look at the repercussions with what's called urban renewal, that shapes cities across the country, there's over 200 residents that were displaced in almost all Black in cities. In one part of the city, it was 221 acres. You can see whole sections of this city that was completely all a thriving African-American business district, but you can see that it's, and homes, and you can see it was right next to the city center. And so they were trying to move Blacks away from city centers off to the edges. And then that's what happened here in Pasadena with Parsons when they were building that on Fair Oaks. The only vestiges you can kind of see now from what was left in Old Town is the Friendship Baptist Church on Dayton. And Pastor Smith calls it the jewel of Old Town. But that was founded in 1893. The Interstate Highway Act kind of came through, and it pretty much, it was pretty amazing how that shaped America. Oftentimes, if you look where the highways came in cities all across the country, they sliced right through thriving African-American business districts. You can see that with North Lincoln, and there's a thriving Black business district there that has never really recuperated. And then this gentleman who's dearly loved, Judge Harry Pragerson, when he saw this happening, when the Century Freeway, anytime you guys go, like to LAX, you go on the Century Freeway, the 105. And that was one of the most expensive freeways built in the history of the US, because he made sure that there would be no displacement, that everyone would not lose a job and they would gain a home. And that's started what's called Century Housing as a result. So he's dearly beloved. In Pasadena, clear back in the day, 1855, 1843, there was a guy named Gosney that was, he purchased land to prevent encroachment of Blacks outside of the area they were supposed to live. He was an extreme racist. In fact, he started what's called the Human Betterment Foundation, which ended up looking at how do you improve people through sterilization. And that idea ended up sterilizing over 6,000 people in California. And then the idea, the Nazis got a hold of that idea, and that came out of Pasadena. It's a very dramatic, sad part of Pasadena's history. So you can hear these same terms when we go to planning commissions today: neighborhood stability, neighborhood character. These terms were formed way back in the day to try to prevent Blacks from coming into white neighborhoods. This is an interesting, when I first bought my house here in Northwest Pasadena, there's a man I met up the street named Lloyd Watson, and I noticed these 2 peaks on his house, and I said, I just love those 2 peaks. And he says, oh yeah, I built that for my honey, you know. And he says, you know, we had cash to buy a house, and they wouldn't sell to us anywhere other than Northwest. So we came up here, and there was a realtor who had the listing, and he walked out his door, and he says, you know, across the street, he says, you want to look at that house? They were dumbfounded. They ended up buying 5 homes on our street. They're amazing folks, and I'm just always blown away. You know, when he said, when he went to different parts of the city, they would come right out and say, I'm sorry, Lloyd, we can't sell to you, you're Black. It was that obvious and blunt. I mentioned briefly about Mercy Young, which is interesting because her dad passed for white. So he was able to buy a house in a Black neighborhood. He was so proud of that. He put his racial covenant on the mantle of the fireplace for all to see. So we've got the Civil Rights era. The Fair Housing Act was finally, you know, starting to get passed. And then there was unintended consequences. So finally, Blacks had a chance to leave Northwest and other parts of the city. But what that did, when you had wealthy folks like my neighbor, you know, Lloyd and others, they started buying in other parts of the city, and that began to cycle even downward, more the strong fabric needed to have a strong community. Martin Luther King, he says, we're tired of having to pay a median rent. This is, you know, obviously in his time, a median rent of $97 a month in Lawndale for 4 rooms, while whites living in South Deering pay $73 a month for 5 rooms. So just incredible racial inequity around housing. And you can see back in the day, it's kind of like what we see today with the movement worldwide. When we finally, right after Martin Luther King was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson finally was able to get the Fair Housing Act passed. So is my time up?
You're getting there.
Okay, I'm almost done. Give me a minute here. I want to mention this lady, Dorothy Gautreaux, African-American single mom, who said, you know, it's not right for me to have no options for my children. The only option she had was to live in an all black, low-income community. So she had a lawsuit against the city of Chicago, and it became a class action lawsuit, and she actually won. And the reason this is so significant is because that's when they stopped the big projects, and they started looking at Section 8 so that you could mix people of color throughout a whole community. They had small bits of affordable housing throughout the whole city of Chicago, and they studied them for over 10 years. And in every single case, their lives improved just because they moved into a neighborhood with more amenities and opportunity. I tested this out for part of my research. I interviewed 7 gang kids at the Harambe Center, and they all said that you know, the reason they joined a gang is because of school. That they were put in classes saying that they were special ed kids, and the stigma was too much for them. And so they all were all in a segregated neighborhood. They had very few role models. And one kid, his brother was put in a family in East Pasadena. And just by moving to a different part of the city, he's the only one that ended up going to college. So I'm going to skip these other ones and just mention briefly up to the day today. Now, because Northwest ended up kind of cycling downward, and people couldn't get loans to improve their homes, and then all of a sudden, you know, you had all these private schools and people, lots of private schools because of the desegregation. People didn't necessarily want their children going to school with people of color, and so the realtors even have had this same story, you know, the schools are bad. And so, so we've got to deal with this. And I think our school district is doing a good job of trying to change the story. But they often say if you buy a house in the city, you're going to have to earn and have enough to also pay for private school. So I don't believe that's true. We have some excellent public schools. So I'm going to finish up with just whole cities started. There's a movement to start cities that would be separate from areas of poverty, that would be separate from people of color. You can see cities starting throughout Southern California that separate from other cities so that they can have more affluence. Mike Davis wrote a book that has some riveting chapters about this. And then there's some tools to undo a lot of this. Community Land Trust, we're starting a team for that. But what's so fascinating about this is that finally, in a place where Anthony and I went last fall with our Housing Justice Institute, and Mercy was with us, it's the biggest lawsuit finally given to Black farmers, 1.5 billion damages because of the injustices around land. And so that was the very first community land trust that was started in our country. Now they're now throughout the country, so that you can own your home but not the land, making it affordable. So the Glass-Steagall Act had a huge effect, started bad banking practices, started bungling loans, and then we ended up with all kinds of mortgages, and Blacks lost 3 times their wealth, or lost, were more likely to lose their homes in the subprime time. So now the time of gentrification, and today it's again pushing people out of the city, and Beverly has said, let's make it possible to again stay in this city. So I'm going to end with just mentioning how Steve Mnuchin, who had One West Bank, he was the director of that, the president. He's now joined the Trump team, and he was called the foreclosure king. 16,000 foreclosures, reverse mortgages, hurting older people through these reverse mortgages. So we still have racial steering today, saying, you know, this is a better neighborhood for you. You shouldn't live in this area. That's illegal. We need to have ways to make that, to change that. Our Black population has decreased by 24% just in the last 10 years. And so if you want further study on any of this powerful story called The Making of Ferguson, I highly recommend. It really talks about a lot of these policies in detail and what's caused the kind of disparate segregation we've seen in our country. Conspiracy the Good, I understand it's pretty hard to find at this point, but it talks about the whole history of Pasadena from 1875 forward. And then there's an article on a lot of what I've shared. It kind of succinctly puts it together here on this link. So we'll make sure you get these PowerPoints. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Jill. Yes, I read The Making of Ferguson. It is a very, very compelling and a pretty good summary of all of the horrible housing policies we've had across the United States. And this is just kind of to get you some references to be able to do more searching and more studying of this particular issue, which has become so critical, especially now. And now we're going to talk about some potential solutions for these horrible policies. Next, we're honored to have Pasadena Council member John Kennedy to speak about racism and housing in Pasadena, as well as some possible ways to solve racial disparities. We very much appreciate his making time here tonight out of his busy schedule, and we understand he'll need to leave our forum as soon as his presentation concludes. A Pasadena native, Councilmember John Kennedy grew up in Pasadena and attended Pasadena schools. He holds dual degrees from the University of Southern California in International Relations and Social Science Communications, Economics, as well as his Juris Doctor degree from Howard University School of Law in Washington, D.C. Councilmember Kennedy has significant experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He's devoted his life to community service as a civic leader and community organizer. At the age of 25, he was the youngest person to serve as president of the Pasadena branch of the NAACP. Locally, he worked in the finance, city attorney, police, and public works departments of the city of Pasadena. He's also served as founder and secretary of the Pasadena Police Foundation, chair of the Community Health Alliance of Pasadena, board member of the Pasadena Child Health Foundation, and chair of the Community Development Committee. In 2013, Mr. Kennedy was elected to the Pasadena City Council, representing its 3rd district, and he has served continuously to the present. Since January of 2015, he has worked for a family company with responsibilities in philanthropy, real estate, and business development. He's also a board member of the Tom Bradley Legacy Foundation at UCLA and a member of the Black Alumni Council at USC. I cannot see him. So I'm going to need to move my, we're going to be doing a question and answer.
After he speaks, yeah.
I see you.
John, are you there?
Kennedy. Hello.
Well, thank you very much for having me a part of this important discussion and dissemination of information to our community. This is important work, and all of you who are on the call, I know this is important to you in terms of building a better Pasadena. So my father, who was born in 1907 in Newberry, South Carolina, and my mother born in 1923 in Starkville, Mississippi. When they came of age, father before the age of 18 and mother at the age of 18, decided to move away from the deep, racist, Jim Crow South. First, my father north, then to California, and then my mother directly from Mississippi to Pasadena, really Los Angeles first, then to Pasadena. So my 7 sisters and 2 brothers and myself have been a part of Pasadena for quite some time. My family's been here for approximately 80 years. So we've seen a lot of what Jill talked about in her presentation firsthand. So as a child growing up in Pasadena, I remember distinctly when quote unquote integration began. After Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, we had a similar case in the city of Pasadena called Spangler versus Pasadena Schools. And in that case, we determined, or Judge Manuel Real determined that our schools were segregated, that Black children, white children received unequal education, and the old saying that had come out of Brown versus the Board of Education was applicable here, and that was to integrate or desegregate at all deliberate speed. So when I was at Cleveland Elementary School, what happened was before the white children were bused to Cleveland, where there had been asphalt, there became grass. Where there were no jungle gyms and pergolas, all of that came in. Where there was no library, a library somehow appeared seemingly overnight, all to accommodate the interests of the parents of these little white children. Now, why do I say to accommodate the interests of the parents? Because generally, the children in elementary school would not be demanding all of this infrastructure. The parents would, to make sure that their children receive the best education possible. And so that's why all these amenities came to my little elementary school in Northwest Pasadena, bounded by forest, Palisade, a little distant way from Lincoln, and then Washington. That was the rectangle that encompassed Grover Cleveland Elementary. And parenthetically, last year, Cleveland Elementary was closed, unfortunately, because of budget cuts. The insidious nature of racism was demonstrated to the young children in Pasadena, particularly Black children, immediately with desegregation. One of the things that the parents demanded was a special school within a school. And at Cleveland Elementary School, there was what was called the resource room. And in the resource room, there were all these pedagogical tools, learning tools for these children. And most of the children that were allowed to go to the resource room happened to be white. And the few African Americans that were allowed generally came from private schools like Pasadena Christian, example of which is former Councilwoman Joyce Streeter's sons, Jeff Streeter and Julius Streeter. So I had to demand to be a part of that program, and I did. I was termed a mentally gifted minor and was allowed to partake in that resource room and other amenities that the white kids benefited from. Now, what's particularly striking about my involvement at Cleveland Elementary School is that Claire Bogard and Bill Bogard, Bill would subsequently become a rotated mayor and then the first elected mayor of the city of Pasadena. They were co-presidents of the of the Parents, Teachers, Students Association at Cleveland Elementary School. Now, why is that important? It's important because you had a liberal white couple who had children vested in the Pasadena Unified School District, and they were starting out. And as they were starting out, the number one issue as it relates to educating children is parental involvement, however that parental involvement plays out, whether it's one parent, two parents, or grandparents serving in parentis for the child, local in parentis. So as the income of Claire and Bill Bogard increased, the subsequent children did not go to public school. They went to private school. Now, why is that particularly telling? Is because even though they sent their children to private school, their last two, they, meaning Bill Bogard, was instrumental in eliminating the unfair election system in the city of Pasadena, which was that if you had to get 50+1% in your district, or 50+1 in your district to be elected. If you got less than 50% of the vote, it went citywide. And of course, no African American would be elected in a city that's majority white at that time in our history, if they did not receive the 50+1 the first time around. So in District 1, where Councilmember Tyron Hampton serves currently, there was a woman by the name of Lois Richard, extremely well qualified, husband, MD, and she was involved in the whole Head Start program. Actually, Lois Richard ran the program. So when she ran for the city council, she got 49% of the vote. She had a runoff with a gentleman by the name of John Crowley. John Crowley lived in Linda Vista. So when the vote went citywide, Lois lost and John Crowley was elected to represent that area. Now, why is John Crowley so important? Well, John Crowley worked with State Senator Newt Russell to craft legislation to save the old fire and police retirement system. The old fire and police retirement system was unfunded, and if it was not fully funded, there was a risk that the city of Pasadena would have to file bankruptcy. So historically, with redevelopment law, 20% of the tax increment monies from downtown developments were to go to build affordable housing. But because of this legislation called SB 481, all of that trust fund money went away. And for the last 20 plus years prior to the abolishment of redevelopment law, about $200 million went into the FPRS system, the old fire and police retirement system. None of those monies went to fund what was originally was supposed to fund, and that was affordable housing. And not just affordable housing, but low and moderate affordable housing. So if you want to track empirically where the city of Pasadena had significant difficulty in trying to fund affordable housing, I suggest that we go back to this artificial way of saving the fire and police retirement fund, SB 41, and see all the money that was diverted, in my language, stolen from the community to build affordable housing. So why did we have 20% of the tax increment going to build low and moderate income housing in the first place? In part, it was to appease the fact that Black communities in Pasadena were wholesalely removed. Jill alluded to what they call Negro removal. Some people use the N word and couple that with removal. So it was to appease the Blacks, the African Americans in the community, that we would actually replace the land that we took from you under the guise of urban renewal. So Parsons is an example of where urban renewal took place and took flourishing families, land, businesses, and also where Kings Villages is located. That was a historic area of historic homes that today would in no way be torn down. And they put a Black face in front of the Black homeowners to force them to sign on the dotted line below market their homes to build Kings Villages and what was termed the Pepper Project, the Pepper Project. These are homes today that would be worth about $1 million a piece, without exaggeration, or close to that. So when we talk about housing in the city of Pasadena, we can't forget the racist platform that city government and city's fathers, because there were no women per se in power, city fathers adopted to ensure that a certain group of people would be treated great and another group that happened to be primarily African Americans would be treated subhuman, if you will, or less than first class citizens. So now as it relates to the Latino community, we'll just call it the Mexican American community. This whole area was essentially stolen from Mexico. Mm-hmm. And the ramifications of that have been rippling racism towards our brown brothers and sisters as well. We initially saw more African Americans in Pasadena than we saw Mexican Americans. But part of the reason for that was the mission system that discriminated against Mexicans. Part of the reason for that is that their land was bereft from them. Part of the reason for that, the whole indigenous people, the Tongva, Tongva, their land was stolen as well. That's the Cajamonga area. There were Cajamongas and Tongvas and Gabrielinos, indigenous people, as a part of Pasadena. Now, the elite in Pasadena have always placated other groups, thrown bones, and never fully funded what was needed to build affordable housing, to replace that which was stolen or taken for under the guise of urban renewal. So also Jill spoke about the Human Betterment Foundation. Now, what's critically important about the Human Betterment Foundation that was housed at the California Institute of Technology, recently the new president at the University of Southern California decided to remove von Kleinschmidt, Rufus von Kleinschmidt, a former president of USC, from a prominent position in that institution because he sat on the board of the Human Betterment Foundation, a foundation that was rooted in white supremacy, eugenics, determining that certain genes should not be passed from one generation to the next generation, sterilized 9,000 African-American servicemen primarily, and 6,000 African-American women from the city of Pasadena. They didn't live necessarily all in Pasadena, but the work of the sterilization happened because of this board of directors, which included some of the most prominent members of the Pasadena community, including the former president. He was president at Stanford, and then he became the former president of Stanford, was on that board, and a whole host of very prominent names, including one of the founders of the most prestigious law firm in the city of Pasadena, directly across the street from City Hall, and that is the law firm of Hahn and Hahn. But there are other names as well, and one of the names was Gosney, G-O-S-N-E-Y. And Gosney was a racist. Gosney was a racist, and what he did, he communicated directly with the National Socialist Party in Nazi Germany. And they took this eugenic concept of preventing certain people from procreating, and they used that as the basis of the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany. So there was a direct connection between Gosney at Caltech and Nazi Germany, or the National Socialist Party in Germany. So we have that ugly past that Pasadena has built on and sought to quietly forget. But you can't quietly forget if the foundation upon which you build a city is based on racism. Now, as it relates to housing presently, when redevelopment law was abolished, as all of you know, it reduced the amount of money available to produce affordable housing. So we've got to figure out a way to fund more affordable housing. In my district, which has a high concentration, District 3, that's bounded basically by El Molino on the east, the north of Colorado at Lake, all the way over to the freeway on the west, take the freeway north, all the way to Washington, Washington on the south, all the way to Los Robles on the east, and go north to basically Ladera and then over to El Molino. That's basically District 3. We have the highest amount of affordable housing in the whole city. We have the most affordable housing development taking place. And one of the areas that we need to concentrate on is that in the building of the Parsons complex, currently called Lincoln Properties, there was $10 million that was transferred basically in lieu fees, but nevertheless by ordinance, there was a requirement that they transfer $10 million to a nonprofit to build affordable housing. Well, that affordable housing is going to be built on the northeast corner of Orange Grove and Lincoln. Having said that, we know that if those monies have been transferred to the city of Pasadena as opposed to a nonprofit, one, Lincoln Properties would have had to pay more than the 9.x, I can't remember the exact amount, more to the city of Pasadena than to the nonprofit. The nonprofit has a fairly decent track record. Heritage Housing Partners, which is the executive director, is Charles Loveman. Also in my district, you see Heritage Square, a project that I worked on before I was elected to the city council. Heritage Square North, which is providing 69 units of affordable housing to seniors. And then Heritage Square South will provide an equal amount of housing to our brothers and sisters who were formerly homeless, who are seniors, and will provide, as it stands now, supportive services. And I believe Ann Miskey and her organization, Union Station, will be intimately involved in doing that. So earlier, one of the speakers talked about a partnership for providing affordable housing. The entity that provided that affordable housing is really building billions of dollars of affordable housing, and that is Bridge Housing. Bridge Housing. And if any of you want to find a reputable builder of affordable housing to partner with as you seek the churches to build affordable housing, they would be a great partnership or partner. Also in my district, a gentleman by the name of Jim Osterling and his team are building 200 units of affordable housing, single room occupancy, basically, but that's extraordinary. And Jim also, I believe, happens to be president of the Pasadena City College system. And that's going to be extraordinary, given he is paving the way for building more affordable housing. We thought that on the old Fuller property that we were going to get even more affordable housing. From the last conversations I've had with Fuller Seminary, which is located in my district, they're coming back to Pasadena, even though they have bought land to the east of Pasadena where they were going to have a new campus. So we need to apply appropriate pressure on the leadership at Fuller Seminary to ensure that affordable housing covenants that exist currently continue into perpetuity on properties, at least housing that they own. That's big. Jill and others have been spot on in articulating that and make sure making sure that the council does not forget. So that's critically important.
Councilmember Kennedy, we really appreciate all the support you've given the city for affordable housing. And in closing, I had one last question, if you don't mind. At the car caravan on June 2nd that honored George Floyd, you mentioned land grants as part of a reparations as well as funding. And in light of the history of displacement of African Americans from Pasadena from about 25% to closer to 10% today, what are some ideas the city could consider to bring about more equitable development that would assure opportunity for our African American residents?
Well, the first piece for everyone who's on the line to understand, when enslaved Black people or African Americans garnered or gained their freedom, they were promised 40 acres and a mule. They also were promised that in the South, the troops, meaning Union troops, would be there to ensure justice, ensure fairness. Every step of the way, like the indigenous people of the Americas, promise after promise was broken. But when it came to white peasants from Europe, they were provided land grants. And land grants means exactly that. A grant is something that you don't pay back. And so they were provided a leg up, if you will, in trying to enjoy the fruits of America and all that America means. So that was never provided to African Americans. And the only thing that I can think of historically that's close is land grant colleges like Howard University and the whole historically Black college system. Many of them were created by churches and land grants from different governments. So when I mention after the death of this ecumenical person named George Floyd, who came like Jesus came to set the captives free, that they would attack him after death, call him a criminal. And if you think about the crucifixion of Jesus, the three men who are crucified are all what? In the eyes of the state, they're all criminals. Now, some would call George Floyd a criminal. I would call him a messenger, a saint. And I would look to the people across the world, irrespective of race, who are saying enough is enough, no more. So to bring it back home, I'm suggesting that there has to be a way for this country and this city to deal with its original sin. And the way you deal with the original sin, you give up some of your what? White privilege. And I spoke about white privilege at the mega reunion. It did not want to be heard. Even in a primary African American audience, they did not want me to discuss white privilege because it makes people so uncomfortable. But we have to have that honest discussion if we're going to have a solution for the affordable housing crisis that exists in Pasadena and exists across the nation. Now, how do we fund this? We are going to have to reprioritize what's important to Pasadena, and we're going to have to use more general fund dollars. So no, I don't support defunding the police. I think it's a bad idea. But I do support taking a look at the $91 million budget that we just approved, and it's coming back to the council to see if there are ways in which we can provide sufficient policing and reduce the budget and provide those resources by which we reduce to something that's critically important. Other than policing, keeping the community safe, I can think of no other important diversion of general fund dollars other than public education than to house the people who live in Pasadena, who grew up in Pasadena, who have lower wage jobs, who need vouchers, who need affordable housing, who need Section 8, etc. And since my involvement on the city council, I got the city to adopt a policy that affordable housing has to be distributed not only in District 3, but from a policy perspective, everywhere in the city, and that has not been the case previously. So that's how I'd answer that. Next question.
Actually, we could go on all evening, Councilmember Kennedy, but we're out of time. And you've given us—
That's unfair. That's unfair because I came ready. I did my research. I knew that I was going to be asked tough questions. And let me just say this. This is about all of us, black, white, brown, red, yellow, coming together in the death of George Floyd and recognizing, if we will, that the world has changed. We cannot continue to do what we did yesterday if we're really going to address these issues.
Well, we're really looking forward.
We do need a housing commission, something that Jill came to me about when I first met her, and I advocated for that. The city council is not all-knowing. They can't be all-knowing. We need experts in the field advising the city council how to craft, how to build expeditiously about 1,000 affordable units. And I don't mean moderate, I'm talking about very low and low income qualified units. Moderate is easy. The very low and low's not easy. And I don't have all the answers, but I bet you if we all come together and break down all these unnecessary barriers, that we can figure this out. And you need to hold me accountable. You need to hold all my colleagues accountable. And don't just hold the minorities accountable. Hold Madison accountable, Tornek accountable, Masuda accountable, Gordo accountable. Margaret McAustin has been one of the few white champions more than any other on the city council. Somehow she gets it as it relates to building affordable housing. And if anything I'll remember her tenure for is her compassion and her passion to build affordable housing. So again, I just want to thank all of you, all 77 of you who stayed on, for allowing me to share just a snippet of my beliefs. And I did prepare, but I tried to speak with my heart, and hopefully I'll be somewhat impactful as we go forward as a community.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Kennedy. We look forward to a lot more discussion about the budget. And we're going to be talking now, going into breakout sessions. We know you have to leave. We're going to be going into breakout sessions. There's a lot of very good and interesting ideas for solutions that a lot of other educators have come up with, and we're going to discuss those. And we're looking forward to all of us being part of the solution here in Pasadena. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.
It was great.
Well, do questions and answers, but we're now supposed to be dividing up into breakout sessions to discuss the two questions. There were a lot of comments. Anthony, in terms of questions, do you have a suggestion?
Can't we have, I think we should have the member address the comments before he leaves, before we go into small group.
Well,
Okay.
yeah, I think we need to process some of what we've heard. I think that this has been an amazingly powerful and rich night. And I think sometimes it's easier in smaller groups to sort of process what we've heard and to come up with some ideas. So I'd like to break us up into groups of 6, and then afterwards we can have some discussion. Now, we plan to end at 9, but Jill and I will gladly keep this open for as long as people want to share. Sometimes we share in what we call the parking lot after the meeting ends from, till 10 o'clock. So there'll be plenty of time to ask questions, plenty of time for discussion. But I think right now I'd like for everybody to connect with each other in small groups. So I'm going to break us up.
First of all, I just want to say.
Let me just mention.
Yes, Jill.
I just want to say a couple things that maybe not everyone had a chance to read what we sent last night, but there's San Francisco and Portland had this interesting policy called Right to Return, specifically helping African Americans to undo gentrification. There's another look at what's called the affirmatively furthering fair housing. That's now, we'll be able to look at statistics and the impacts of racial division and begin to document that and try to create change. There's a bunch of ideas that especially in looking at maybe there's a lot of ideas, and I hope that you can come up with some of those if you had a chance to take a peek at those in these breakout groups. So thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you. Before we do that, I also want to mention at this point that if you're inspired by the program tonight, please consider making a donation to Making Housing and Community Happen, which is doing so much to help increase affordable housing and housing for our homeless neighbors here in Pasadena and throughout the San Gabriel Valley. And they've been helping a big help for our homeless neighbors as well. And Anthony's going to put the website address in the chat box. And you can read about Making Housing and Community Happen's many programs. So the 2 questions we're going to address in the breakout groups for about 10 minutes. First, the first question is, are you now more aware of how you have benefited or been hurt or discriminated against in your personal housing situation because of systemic racism? And if you can discuss those specifics. And second, what do you see as possible solutions that you'd like to see implemented to address the systemic racism in housing? Anthony sent you some suggestions in an email to you yesterday. There's a lot of ideas that are being batted around, and we're really interested in your discussion with your group. So Anthony's going to break us up into groups, and recommend that you choose a leader, take some notes, and summarize for the whole group when you come back.